Welcome back to Forgotten Cars. Today, we're uncovering 7 American pickups that almost disappeared from history. Some were ahead of their time, some were incredibly unusual, and others simply couldn't compete with the big names. But why does nobody remember these trucks today? Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which one surprised you the most. Let's get started.
1957 Studebaker TransStar, the pickup that refused to give up. Why did Studebaker keep fighting for the pickup market when the company was already in serious trouble? That's the mystery behind the 1957 Studebaker TransStar, because by this point, Studebaker wasn't the confident American manufacturer it had once been. The company was fighting for survival, competing against giants like Ford, Chevrolet, and Dodge with far fewer resources. And yet, Studebaker refused to walk away. Instead, it kept trying to improve its trucks. The 1957 TransStar is a perfect example. At first glance, it might look like just another vintage American pickup, but look closer and you start to see how unusual Studebaker's situation really was. The truck was already beginning to look old-fashioned compared with the newest offerings from Detroit. Ford was pushing aggressive new designs. Chevrolet was constantly updating its trucks. Dodge was fighting for attention with increasingly modern styling. And Studebaker? Studebaker was trying to keep an older pickup relevant. So the company gave the TransStar a bold new face. One of the most noticeable changes was the fiberglass grille. And that was not something you expected to see on an ordinary American pickup in the 1950s. The grille gave the TransStar a distinctive appearance and helped make the truck look newer than the basic design underneath. Studebaker was essentially saying, "We're still here." But the company wasn't relying only on appearance. The TransStar could also be equipped with a V8, giving buyers considerably more performance than you might expect from a pickup that already looked like it belonged to an earlier era. And that's where the story becomes almost heartbreaking, because Studebaker had the ideas, it had the engineers, it could still build interesting vehicles, but it didn't have the financial strength of Ford or Chevrolet. Imagine trying to compete against companies with enormous factories, massive advertising budgets, huge dealer networks, and millions of vehicles on the road. Then imagine trying to do it while your own company is struggling financially. Every new design costs money. Every new engine costs money. Every update requires investment. And Studebaker had less room for mistakes than its competitors. Yet, the company continued. That's what makes the TransStar so fascinating. It wasn't simply a truck, it was evidence of a company refusing to disappear. Think about what was happening in America at the time. The 1950s were an incredible period for the automobile industry. Cars were becoming bigger and more dramatic. Consumers were demanding new designs every few years. Manufacturers were constantly competing to create the next big thing. And Studebaker? Studebaker was trying to survive in the middle of all of it. The TransStar was part of that fight, but there was a major problem. A new grille could make an old truck look fresher, but it couldn't completely erase the financial problems behind the company. A V8 could make the truck more competitive, but it couldn't give Studebaker the production scale of Ford. And stylish updates couldn't create the enormous customer base Chevrolet already had. That's the tragedy of the TransStar. It wasn't necessarily a bad pickup, it was simply fighting a battle that was becoming increasingly difficult to win. And eventually, Studebaker's automotive story would come to an end. When that happened, the TransStar became something very different. It stopped being a new pickup competing for buyers and started becoming a surviving piece of a lost American automobile company. That's why finding one today can feel strangely emotional. Imagine seeing a 1957 Studebaker TransStar sitting in an old garage. Maybe the paint has faded, maybe the chrome is damaged, maybe the V8 hasn't started in decades. But the Studebaker badge is still there, and suddenly you're looking at a truck from a company that once competed with America's biggest manufacturers, a company that built cars, built trucks, built engines, and tried desperately to remain independent. The TransStar represents that final struggle. Studebaker knew it was falling behind, but instead of just giving up, it kept changing the truck. New styling, new details, more power, more attempts to attract buyers. It was almost as if the company was saying, one more chance, and then another and another. But eventually, there comes a point when the problem isn't the product, it's the company behind it. That's perhaps the most important lesson from the 1957 TransStar. Sometimes a vehicle can be interesting, clever, and perfectly capable, and still lose. Not because the engineers failed, not because customers hated it, but because the company simply didn't have enough resources to keep fighting. And that's why the TransStar deserves the spotlight. It is more than an old pickup. It's a snapshot of the final years of Studebaker's struggle. A truck that looked towards the future while carrying the weight of the company's past. A pickup that received a bold fiberglass grille at V8 power while the company behind it was fighting for survival. And perhaps that's why the TransStar feels so different from a Ford or Chevrolet today. When you see a famous Ford pickup, you see a classic. When you see a 1957 Studebaker TransStar, you see a survivor. A reminder of an American manufacturer that refused to disappear quietly. Studebaker didn't keep building pickups because everything was going well. It kept building them because it wasn't ready to admit that the fight was already being lost. 2. 1958 GMC Wideside, the modern pickup everyone forgot. How did GMC create a modern-looking pickup that almost nobody remembers today? That's the strange story behind the 1958 GMC Wideside. Because when you look at this truck today, it doesn't look like something that should have disappeared from automotive history. It looks modern. It looks clean. It looks surprisingly stylish. And yet, mention classic American pickups from the late 1950s, and most people immediately think of Ford or Chevrolet. GMC? Almost forgotten. And that's exactly what makes the Wideside so interesting. By the late 1950s, American pickup trucks were going through a major transformation. For decades, traditional pickups had obvious separate rear fenders. You could immediately tell that you were looking at a work truck. But buyers were beginning to want something different. They wanted smoother styling. They wanted a truck that looked good parked in front of the house, and they wanted something that didn't look like it belonged exclusively on a farm. GMC understood this shift. So the Wideside moved away from the traditional exposed fender appearance. The body flowed more smoothly around the cargo bed, giving the truck a much cleaner and more modern appearance. And that small design change made a huge difference. Instead of looking like a simple work machine, the Wideside started to look like a personal vehicle, something you could drive every day, something you could actually be proud of. And that's important because the pickup market was changing rapidly. The American pickup was no longer just about work, it was becoming part of everyday American life. People were using trucks for recreation, for business, for family transportation, and simply because they liked the way they looked. GMC was right in the middle of that transformation. The Wideside was essentially GMC saying, a pickup doesn't have to look rough to be useful. And the idea was smart. But GMC had a problem. It was competing against Chevrolet. And Chevrolet had an enormous advantage. The two brands were both part of General Motors, but Chevrolet had much stronger recognition among ordinary American buyers. When people thought about buying a pickup, Chevrolet was already one of the first names that came to mind. GMC had to fight harder for attention, and that difference would eventually affect how history remembered these trucks.
The Wideside could have modern styling, it could be well engineered, it could be practical, but if fewer people remembered the name, fewer people would preserve the vehicle. And that's exactly what happened. Thousands of these trucks were built to work. They weren't treated like future collectibles. Owners used them, they loaded them, they drove them through bad weather, they parked them outside, they repaired them when necessary, and eventually they replaced them. The trucks that survived were the lucky ones. Some ended up in barns, some were kept by families for decades, some were restored by enthusiasts who understood what they had, but many simply disappeared. And that's why the 1958 GMC Wideside is so fascinating today. You can look at one and immediately see the beginning of the modern pickup, the smoother body, the integrated bed, the cleaner proportions. It's almost surprising that this design is more than 60 decades old. And yet, the name doesn't have the same legendary status as Ford or Chevrolet. That's the irony. GMC was participating in the same styling revolution. It was helping create the modern American pickup. But when automotive history was written, Ford and Chevrolet received most of the attention. GMC became the forgotten sibling. And perhaps that's why discovering a Wideside today feels like finding something that shouldn't have disappeared. Imagine walking into an old barn and seeing one covered in dust. At first, you might think, that's a nice old pickup. Then you notice the GMC badge. You look at the body. You realize how unusual the design is for 1958. And suddenly you're looking at a forgotten chapter of American truck history. A truck that helped move pickups away from the traditional work truck appearance and toward the stylish modern personal trucks we know today. The Wideside wasn't trying to reinvent the entire automobile. It was simply responding to a changing market. But sometimes small design decisions have a much bigger impact than people realize. The smooth-sided bed made the truck look less agricultural, more modern, more personal, and more appealing to a new generation of buyers. That's why the Wideside deserves to be remembered. Not because it was the most powerful pickup, not because it was the rarest, but because it represents a turning point. The moment when American pickups began to stop looking like pure work equipment and started becoming something people actually wanted to own. And maybe that's the real mystery. How did GMC create a pickup that looked so modern for its time, only for almost everyone to forget it existed? The answer may be simple. It wasn't because the Wideside was unimportant. It was because Ford and Chevrolet were simply louder. And sometimes in automotive history, the loudest name isn't necessarily the most interesting one.
Did Dodge quietly help invent the modern pickup? And why did history forget it? That's the fascinating question behind the 1958 Dodge Sweptline. Because when people talk about the transformation of American pickups during the 1950s, the conversation usually centers around Ford and Chevrolet. But Dodge was doing something very important too. And in 1958, the company introduced a pickup that looked dramatically different from the traditional trucks Americans were used to. The Sweptline didn't just receive a new grille or a few cosmetic changes. Dodge changed the shape of the truck itself. And the most important detail was hidden in plain sight. The rear wheels were tucked underneath the cargo bed. That sounds like a small engineering decision, but visually it changed everything. Traditional pickups often had separate rear fenders sitting outside the bed. You could clearly see where the wheels were. The body looked like a cab with a box attached behind it. The Sweptline created a much smoother appearance. The outer body panels flowed over the rear wheels, making the entire truck look wider, cleaner, and more integrated. And suddenly, the pickup started looking less like a piece of farm equipment and more like a modern automobile. That was a huge change. Imagine seeing one in 1958. You've grown up seeing traditional American pickups with exposed rear fenders, then suddenly, here comes this Dodge. Smooth sides, wide body, integrated cargo box. The rear wheels almost disappear. It looks futuristic. And the strangest part is that today, the basic shape seems completely normal. That's because the idea eventually became the standard. Look at modern pickups. The body usually extends around the rear wheels. The cargo bed and cab are visually integrated. The truck has a much smoother, wider appearance. In other words, the Sweptline was moving toward the shape we now take for granted. And that's why the question becomes so interesting. Did Dodge quietly help invent the modern pickup? In many ways, yes. Dodge wasn't alone in pushing this evolution, of course. Other manufacturers were experimenting with similar ideas at the same time. But the Sweptline was an important part of that transition. It showed that a pickup didn't have to look like a traditional work truck. It could be sleek, it could be modern, it could have a more unified body design. And it could still do the job. That combination was extremely important, because the American pickup market was changing. The 1950s were bringing a new kind of buyer. Someone who didn't necessarily need a truck for farming. Someone who might use it for work during the week and recreation on the weekend. Someone who wanted a truck that looked good. And manufacturers noticed. The pickup was becoming a lifestyle vehicle. Dodge was adapting to that change. But then came the problem. Ford and Chevrolet were already dominating the conversation. Ford had an enormous customer base. Chevrolet had an enormous customer base. Their trucks were everywhere. Their advertising was everywhere. And their names became deeply connected with American pickup culture. Dodge had to fight for attention. That meant a revolutionary-looking truck could still be overlooked. And that's exactly what makes the Sweptline so frustrating from a historical perspective. It was doing something important, but it didn't receive the same cultural recognition. Think about how automotive history works. The most famous vehicles become legends. People preserve them, they restore them, they make videos about them. They put them in museums. But the vehicles that were simply good, practical working machines often disappear. And the Sweptline was exactly that. People bought them to work. They carried tools, they hauled equipment, they transported supplies. They were driven through rain, snow, dirt, and mud. They weren't treated like precious historical objects. They were trucks, and trucks were supposed to work. Eventually, many of them were used until there was nothing left to save. That's how a vehicle that once represented a major design change can become surprisingly difficult to find today. Imagine discovering one now. The body is covered in dust, the paint is faded, the chrome is worn. But you can still see the shape. The smooth sides, the integrated bed, the hidden rear wheels. And suddenly you understand what Dodge was trying to accomplish. They weren't simply making another pickup. They were changing the visual language of the pickup truck. They were taking the truck from this, I'm a work machine, into this, I'm a modern vehicle that happens to have a cargo bed. That distinction would become incredibly important, because decades later, that is exactly how many people see pickups. They're family vehicles, daily drivers, luxury vehicles, off-road machines, work trucks, all in one. The Sweptline helped push that transformation forward. But history didn't give Dodge enough credit. And perhaps that's because innovation doesn't always come from the company that becomes the biggest. Sometimes a smaller player introduces an idea and someone else gets remembered for popularizing it. That's one of the reasons the 1958 Dodge Sweptline deserves a closer look. It wasn't simply an old Dodge. It was a truck from a moment when the entire American pickup industry was changing. A moment when designers were asking, what should a pickup actually look like? Dodge answered with smooth body panels, hidden rear wheels, and a completely different silhouette. And the result looked surprisingly close to the pickups that would come decades later. So maybe the real mystery isn't whether Dodge helped create the modern pickup. The real mystery is why don't more people remember that Dodge was there when it happened? Because the Sweptline wasn't just following the future. It was helping shape it. 4. 1961 International C-Series, the 4x4 pickup that arrived decades too early. How did International build a four-door, four-wheel drive pickup before it became normal? That question makes the 1961 International C-Series one of the most fascinating forgotten trucks in American history. Because today, a four-door, four-wheel drive pickup seems completely ordinary. You see them everywhere. Families drive them, workers use them, people take them off-road. They tow trailers, they carry passengers and cargo at the same time. But in 1961, that combination was anything but normal, and International was already doing it. The story begins with a major redesign. For 1961, International completely reworked its light-duty pickup lineup. The company wasn't simply changing the grille or adding a few chrome pieces. It was changing the basic architecture of the truck. The new chassis allowed the cab to sit lower, giving the vehicle a more car-like feel. And that was important because American pickup buyers were changing. A truck was no longer expected to be nothing more than a rough work machine. People wanted comfort. They wanted easier driving. They wanted a vehicle they could use every day. International understood that. But then the company went even further. It took the C-Series Travelette and combined four doors with four-wheel drive. Think about how strange that sounds when you put it into historical context. A four-door pickup with four-wheel drive in 1961, at a time when most pickups still looked like straightforward work vehicles. International was essentially building something that would become incredibly popular decades later. And that is what makes this truck feel almost like it came from the future. Imagine walking 4. 1961 International C-Series, the 4x4 pickup that arrived decades too early. How did International build a four-door, four-wheel drive pickup before it became normal? That question makes the 1961 International C-Series one of the most fascinating forgotten trucks in American history. Because today, a four-door, four-wheel drive pickup seems completely ordinary. You see them everywhere. Families drive them, workers use them, people take them off-road. They tow trailers, they carry passengers and cargo at the same time. But in 1961, that combination was anything but normal, and International was already doing it. The story begins with a major redesign. For 1961, International completely reworked its light-duty pickup lineup. The company wasn't simply changing the grille or adding a few chrome pieces. It was changing the basic architecture of the truck. The new chassis allowed the cab to sit lower, giving the vehicle a more car-like feel. And that was important because American pickup buyers were changing. A truck was no longer expected to be nothing more than a rough work machine. People wanted comfort. They wanted easier driving. They wanted a vehicle they could use every day. International understood that. But then the company went even further. It took the C-Series Travelette and combined four doors with four-wheel drive. Think about how strange that sounds when you put it into historical context. A four-door pickup with four-wheel drive in 1961, at a time when most pickups still looked like straightforward work vehicles. International was essentially building something that would become incredibly popular decades later. And that is what makes this truck feel almost like it came from the future. Imagine walking into an International dealership in 1961. You expect a traditional pickup, 2 doors, 1 front bench seat, cargo bed behind it. Instead, you see a truck with 4 doors. There's room for passengers in the back, and underneath it is 4-wheel drive. You might think, why would anyone need all of that? And that was probably the exact question International was trying to answer. The Travelette was designed for people who needed both passenger capacity and truck capability. Think about a rancher. He needs 4-wheel drive to reach remote property, but he also needs to carry workers. Or a construction company that needs a truck capable of reaching difficult terrain while transporting an entire crew. Or a family living in a rural area where roads aren't always friendly. Suddenly, the combination makes perfect sense. 1 vehicle, 4 doors, 4-wheel drive, cargo bed. That's an incredibly useful formula, and today it's one of the most popular formulas in the entire pickup market. But here's the incredible part. International was experimenting with it decades before it became mainstream. That's why the C-Series deserves so much attention. It wasn't simply another forgotten pickup. It was an early preview of the modern crew cab 4x4. And yet, somehow, almost nobody remembers it. Why? Once again, International had the same problem. Ford and Chevrolet dominated the American pickup market. Their trucks were everywhere. Their names were familiar. Their dealer networks were enormous, and their designs became deeply embedded in American culture. International was fighting from a much smaller position. That meant even genuinely innovative products could disappear into the background. And there's another problem with early work trucks. They were built to be used hard. A truck like the C-Series wasn't necessarily sitting inside a climate-controlled garage waiting for someone to preserve it. It was working. It was carrying people. It was hauling equipment. It was climbing rough roads. It was being exposed to mud, snow, rain, and years of hard use. Eventually, many were simply worn out, and once they disappeared, the history disappeared with them. That's why surviving C-Series Travelettes are so fascinating today. You can look at one and immediately see something familiar. The 4-door layout, the pickup bed, the 4-wheel drive stance. It looks surprisingly modern. Then you realize the truck dates back to 1961, and suddenly the entire story changes. This wasn't a modern truck with retro styling. It was an early attempt to create the formula that would dominate the pickup market decades later. International was essentially predicting the future, and perhaps the most ironic part is that the company didn't receive the recognition it deserved for doing it. Imagine if Ford had introduced the same concept at exactly the same time. Imagine the advertising, imagine the attention, imagine how many people would remember it today. But International did it, and history largely moved on. That's why I love vehicles like this. They remind us that automotive innovation isn't always created by the company that eventually becomes the market leader. Sometimes the idea appears somewhere unexpected. A company sees a problem, it creates a solution, and years later, everyone else realizes that the solution was brilliant. The C-Series Travelette was essentially asking, why should a truck make you choose between passengers and capability? Why not carry your family or crew and still have a real cargo bed? Why not have 4-wheel drive and 4 doors? International's answer was simple. You can have both. And decades later, the rest of the industry would build an enormous market around that exact idea. That's what makes the 1961 International C-Series so remarkable. It wasn't just ahead of its time in appearance, it was ahead of its time in concept.
a four-door, four-wheel drive pickup that looked almost ordinary today, but was extraordinary when it appeared. And that leaves us with the biggest mystery. How did International manage to build the modern 4x4 family pickup before America even knew it wanted one? The answer is simple. International wasn't waiting for the future. It was already building it.
5. 1963 International C100 bonus load. The pickup that was too practical to become famous. Why did such a practical pickup disappear from America's memory? That's the mystery behind the 1963 International C100 bonus load. And honestly, this is one of those trucks that makes you realize just how much of American automotive history has disappeared. Because the bonus load wasn't some crazy concept car. It wasn't built to attract attention. It wasn't covered in chrome or designed to look like a spaceship. It was built around one simple idea: make the truck more useful. And sometimes, those are exactly the vehicles history forgets. In the early 1960s, International was trying to compete in an American pickup market that was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Ford was growing stronger. Chevrolet was dominating the conversation. Dodge was introducing increasingly modern designs, and International was looking for ways to give its trucks an advantage. The C-Series already had a reputation for being tough and practical, but the bonus load took that philosophy even further. The key was the cargo bed. Instead of relying on the traditional shape that had been common on many pickups, International gave the bonus load a straight-sided bed designed to make better use of the available space. And that might sound like a small detail, but for someone who actually used a truck every day, it mattered. Imagine loading boxes into a traditional pickup. The wheel wells stick into the cargo area. You lose usable space. Some objects don't fit neatly. You have to work around the shape of the bed. Now imagine a design that gives you more straightforward, usable loading space. Suddenly, the truck becomes easier to work with. And that's exactly what International was thinking about. Not how impressive the truck would look in a magazine, not whether it would become a collector's item 50 years later, but how much work can this truck make easier? That practical mindset defined International. The company had deep roots in agriculture, commercial equipment, and heavy-duty machinery. Its customers weren't buying trucks just to look cool. They were buying them because they had jobs to do. Farmers needed to carry equipment. Businesses needed to move supplies. Contractors needed tools. Delivery operators needed space. For these people, every inch of cargo capacity mattered, and the bonus load was designed around that reality. But here's where the story becomes ironic. The very thing that made the bonus load useful also made it easy to forget. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't revolutionary in the way a sports car might be. It didn't have enormous tail fins. It wasn't powered by some outrageous engine. It simply did its job. And trucks that simply do their jobs tend to disappear. Think about what happened to these vehicles after they left the dealership. They were used, hard, every day. A truck like this might spend years hauling materials, then more years carrying farm equipment, then maybe another owner would buy it and use it as a work truck. By the time the vehicle became old enough to be considered collectible, it had already been through decades of punishment. Rust, dents, worn interiors, broken parts, neglected paint, and eventually, many of them were scrapped. That's one of the biggest reasons forgotten work trucks become so rare. People didn't think they were preserving history, they were just using an old truck. And there was another problem. International itself didn't have the cultural power of Ford or Chevrolet. That's important. A Ford pickup from the same era could become a recognizable classic simply because millions of people knew the name.
International had loyal customers, but its light-duty trucks never achieved the same level of public recognition. So when the surviving examples started disappearing, there weren't as many people looking for them. And that's how a practical machine can almost vanish from memory. But look closely at the bonus load today, and the idea starts to make sense again. The straight-sided bed looks simple, maybe even boring, but it's actually a reflection of careful engineering. International wasn't asking, how can we make this truck look more impressive? It was asking, how can we make this truck work better? And that difference is huge, because the best work vehicles aren't always the ones that attract attention. They're the ones that quietly make someone's job easier. That's why the C100 bonus load deserves to be remembered. It represents a completely different side of American automotive design. Not glamour, not speed, not luxury, utility. And perhaps that's what makes discovering one today so satisfying. Imagine seeing a bonus load sitting behind an old barn. At first, you might walk past it. It's just an old International. But then you notice the unusual cargo bed. You start looking at the design. You realize why the engineers built it that way. And suddenly, that forgotten truck becomes interesting. Because you're no longer looking at an obsolete pickup. You're looking at a machine designed around a very simple philosophy. Don't waste space. Make the truck useful. And that philosophy still matters today. Modern pickup manufacturers spend enormous amounts of time thinking about cargo management, bed dimensions, storage, loading, and accessibility. International was thinking about those same problems more than 60 years ago. The difference is that International wasn't trying to turn the idea into a lifestyle statement. It was simply trying to build a better working tool. And perhaps that's why the bonus load disappeared. It wasn't spectacular enough to become famous. It was too ordinary to become legendary. It simply went to work and kept working until most of them were gone. So the real mystery isn't why the bonus load wasn't successful. The mystery is why we don't remember the clever engineering behind it. Because sometimes the most interesting vehicles aren't the ones that change the world with dramatic styling. Sometimes they're the ones that quietly solved a problem and then disappeared. The 1963 International C100 bonus load wasn't built to become a classic. It was built to work. And maybe that's exactly why almost nobody remembers it today.
6. 1969 International Light Line Pickup, the truck that arrived too late. Why did International create a new pickup just as its light truck future was becoming uncertain? That's what makes the 1969 International Light Line so fascinating. Because on paper, this should have been a turning point for International. The company wasn't giving up. It wasn't simply recycling an old design. It was making a serious attempt to modernize its light truck business. New styling, a redesigned cab, multiple configurations, and even the travelette, giving buyers more flexibility than the traditional two-door pickup. But there was one enormous problem. International was running out of time. And that makes the Light Line feel almost like the final chapter of a story that had been going on for decades. By 1969, the American pickup market had become incredibly competitive. Ford had the F-Series, Chevrolet had its CK trucks, Dodge was fighting aggressively for its share. These companies had enormous dealer networks, huge advertising budgets, and millions of loyal customers. International was facing something completely different. It had to convince buyers to choose a brand that most Americans associated more strongly with agricultural equipment, commercial machinery, and heavy trucks than with everyday personal pickups. And yet, International still believed it had a place in the market. So, it redesigned the truck. The Light Line looked considerably more modern than some of the company's earlier pickups. The cab had a cleaner, more contemporary appearance. The overall shape was more integrated, and International offered different body and configuration choices to appeal to different buyers. The company was essentially saying, "We're not finished." And that's what makes this truck so interesting. Because when you look at the Lightline today, it doesn't look like the product of a company that was already approaching the end of its light truck story. It looks like the beginning of something. A new generation, a fresh direction, a truck that could have become the foundation for future International pickups. But history had other plans, and that's where the story becomes almost painful. International wasn't fighting only against better-known trucks, it was fighting against momentum. Ford already had generations of customers. Chevrolet already had generations of customers. Dodge was aggressively developing its own identity. International had to convince buyers to leave those established brands. That's incredibly difficult. Because when someone already owns a Ford pickup and it works, why switch? When a Chevrolet dealer is nearby and parts are easy to find, why take a chance on another brand? That's the invisible battle International was fighting. A pickup isn't just an engine and a bed, it's a support network. Dealers, parts, mechanics, resale value, familiarity, reputation, and Ford and Chevrolet had enormous advantages in all of those areas. International could build a good truck, but it couldn't instantly create decades of consumer loyalty. And that's why the Lightline is such a fascinating what if. What if International had been financially stronger? What if it had been able to invest more heavily in the pickup market? What if the company had reached more private buyers? What if the Lightline had appeared 10 years earlier? Could International have remained a major player in American light trucks? We'll never know. But the truck itself gives us a glimpse of what might have been. The Lightline was not some desperate machine thrown together at the last second. International was still trying to compete, and it was still capable of creating interesting ideas. The Travelette configuration is a perfect example. International had already experimented with combining passenger space and pickup utility. By 1969, that idea was becoming increasingly relevant. American families were changing. People wanted vehicles that could carry passengers during the week and equipment on the weekend. They wanted flexibility. And International understood that trend. But understanding the market isn't enough. You also have to survive long enough to capitalize on it. And that's what International's problem was. It was trying to modernize its pickups while its position in the market was already weakening. It's almost like watching someone renovate a house while the foundation is already cracking. The new design can be excellent, the improvements can be smart, but if the underlying situation doesn't change, the future remains uncertain. And that's exactly how the Lightline feels today. A truck with potential from a company running out of options. There's also something fascinating about how these trucks disappeared. Unlike famous Ford and Chevrolet pickups, many International Lightline trucks were simply used until they were worn out. They were work vehicles. They carried heavy loads. They spent years on farms, construction sites, and businesses. And when they became old, few people thought, we should preserve this because someday it will be a rare classic. Instead, they were replaced, scrapped, or abandoned. And every time one disappeared, another piece of International's light truck history vanished with it. That's why surviving examples are so interesting today. They aren't just old trucks, they're evidence of a company that was still fighting, a company that knew the odds were against it and built a new truck anyway. And the problem is not as shallow as it seems. The Lightline represents that effort. It was modern, it was practical, it offered different configurations, and it carried decades of International's truck building experience. But experience wasn't enough. The American pickup market was becoming a battlefield dominated by enormous companies, and International was increasingly fighting that battle with fewer resources. That's why the question behind the Lightline is so powerful. Why create a new pickup when the future already looked uncertain? Maybe because giving up would have meant accepting defeat.
International wasn't ready to do that. It still believed there were customers who wanted something different. Customers who valued durability. Customers who knew the International name. Customers who wanted a serious working truck. And for a while, that was enough to keep the company going. But eventually, the light truck story came to an end. And when it did, the light line became something far more interesting than a forgotten pickup. It became a last stand, a final attempt to remain relevant in a market that was becoming increasingly difficult to survive in. That's why I think the 1969 International light line deserves to be remembered. Not because it was the most powerful pickup, not because it was the most beautiful, but because of what it represented. A company that knew the odds were against it and built a new truck anyway. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of the light line. It may not have arrived too late because the truck was wrong. It arrived too late because International simply didn't have enough time left.
7. 1958 Studebaker Scotsman pickup, the pickup that refused to show off. Why did Studebaker build a pickup that deliberately looked cheap while everyone else was chasing chrome and glamour? That's what makes the 1958 Studebaker Scotsman so fascinating. Because in the late 1950s, American automobile manufacturers were in a completely different mindset. More chrome, bigger cars, more powerful engines, more decoration, more luxury. Everything seemed to be getting bigger and more extravagant. And then Studebaker did something almost unbelievable. It went in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to make its pickup look expensive, Studebaker tried to make it cheap. Not cheap because it was badly built, cheap because the company wanted to remove anything the customer didn't absolutely need. And that meant stripping the truck down to the basics. Imagine walking into an American dealership in 1958. Everywhere you look, you see shiny chrome, huge grills, bright trim, two-tone paint, fancy interiors, cars designed to make people stop and stare. Then you see the Scotsman. It looks almost embarrassed to be there. Minimal decoration, simple equipment, very little unnecessary trim. No attempt to pretend it was a luxury vehicle. And that's exactly what Studebaker wanted. The company understood something that the other manufacturers were beginning to overlook. Not every buyer wanted glamour. Some people simply wanted an inexpensive truck that could work. A farmer didn't necessarily need acres of chrome. A small business owner didn't need a luxurious interior. A tradesman didn't need a vehicle covered in decorative trim. They needed something they could afford. And Studebaker decided to target those buyers directly. The Scotsman was essentially an exercise in automotive simplicity. Every unnecessary feature represented extra cost. Every piece of decorative trim cost money. Every fancy detail required additional manufacturing. So Studebaker removed them. The result was almost shocking for its time. The truck looked basic because it was supposed to look basic. And that was actually the clever part. Studebaker wasn't embarrassed by the Scotsman's simplicity. It made simplicity the selling point. The message was basically, why pay for things you don't need? And in an era when American manufacturers were obsessed with giving customers more, that was a surprisingly bold philosophy. Because the late 1950s were the age of excess. America was prosperous. Consumers had more money. Manufacturers were competing to make their vehicles more impressive than the competition. But not everyone benefited equally from that prosperity. There were still buyers who needed transportation at the lowest possible cost, and those people represented a real market. Studebaker saw an opportunity. The Scotsman was designed for them. It wasn't trying to win a beauty contest, it was trying to win the price war. And that tells us something important about Studebaker. The company was already struggling financially. It couldn't spend endlessly developing increasingly extravagant trucks just to keep up with Ford, Chevrolet, and Dodge. So instead of fighting them at their own game, Studebaker changed the rules. Ford can give you more chrome? Fine. Chevrolet can give you more styling? Fine. Dodge can give you more decoration? Studebaker's answer was, we'll give you less and charge you less. That sounds simple, but it was actually a very intelligent strategy, because sometimes the best way for a smaller company to compete isn't to copy the biggest companies. It's to find customers the big companies aren't paying enough attention to. And the Scotsman did exactly that. But there's something ironic about this truck. Today, its lack of decoration is part of what makes it interesting. The things that once made the Scotsman look cheap are exactly the things that make it fascinating to collectors. The simple grille, the minimal trim, the straightforward body, the almost utilitarian appearance. What looked inexpensive in 1958 can look incredibly cool today. And that's one of the strange ways automotive history works. A vehicle designed to be affordable can eventually become valuable because it's rare. A truck nobody wanted to preserve can become a truck collectors desperately want to find. And the Scotsman is a perfect example. These weren't necessarily treated like future classics. They were working vehicles. Owners bought them because they were affordable. They used them. They drove them, they worked them, and eventually many simply disappeared. Nobody thought, we should save this because it's going to be a collector's dream 60 years from now. Why would they? It was a cheap truck. That was the entire point. And that's why surviving examples are so interesting today. Because the Scotsman tells a completely different story about 1950s America. It reminds us that not everyone wanted a giant chrome-covered automobile. Some people wanted something honest, something simple, something affordable, something that didn't waste money trying to impress the neighbors. And perhaps that's what makes the Scotsman more modern than it first appears. Today, many buyers are again interested in simpler vehicles. They ask, do I really need all these features? Do I really need all this technology? Do I really need to pay extra for things I don't use? The Scotsman was asking essentially the same question more than 60 years ago. Why pay for decoration when what you really need is a truck? And that makes this little Studebaker surprisingly clever. It wasn't trying to follow the American automobile industry, it was deliberately going against it. While everyone else was looking towards excess, Studebaker looked towards simplicity. While everyone else was adding, Studebaker was removing. And while everyone else was trying to make their pickups look expensive, Studebaker created one that proudly looked inexpensive. That's why the 1958 Studebaker Scotsman deserves to be remembered. Not as the ugliest truck, not as the cheapest truck, but as one of the most unusual strategies ever used by an American truck manufacturer. Studebaker knew it couldn't outspend Ford. It couldn't outshine Chevrolet. So it asked a different question. What if we don't compete on glamour at all? And that's exactly what the Scotsman represented. A pickup that didn't care about showing off. A truck built for people who cared more about the job than the image. And perhaps the greatest irony is, Studebaker built the Scotsman to be forgotten. A simple, inexpensive tool that nobody needed to admire. Yet decades later, that very simplicity is what makes people remember it.